Oh, are you serious?
I never kid about Ronnie.
In 1986, Tom Cruise was on top of the world. Top Gun had come out and become the biggest movie of the year, minting him as a bona fide superstar. However, Cruise had bigger ambitions beyond being an action hero or heartthrob. He wanted to be a legitimate, respected actor, so before Top Gun ever hit theaters, he had already wrapped a role where he'd play opposite one of the biggest movie stars of all time, Paul Newman, whose career Cruise would likely want to emulate, as the older actor was able to find the perfect balance between art and commerce, while never sacrificing his brand as a star. Their movie together, The Color of Money, would go on to be a highlight of both filmographies and notably gritty entry that paired both for the only time with the great Martin Scorsese. Flashback to 1961. Paul Newman was one of the biggest movie stars in the world, but his acting talent was never given its proper due. He was a heartthrob, but the great performances he'd become known for were in his future. Remember, at this point he hadn't made HUD or Cool Hand Luke or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid or any of those movies. His most acclaimed performance up to this point had been in the watered-down Tennessee Williams adaptation Cat in a Hot Tin Roof, although everyone mostly remembers Elizabeth Taylor slinking around in that one rather than Paul Newman. To many, he lacked depth as an actor, which was explored in the recent Ethan Hawke documentary The Last Movie Stars. He was handsome, but was he a great actor? Any doubts would be put aside once audiences got a load of him as Fast Eddie Felson in Robert Rosen's The Hustler. In it, he'd play a pool hall hustler whose ambitions and pride get him into serious trouble, culminating in an intergenerational showdown with the great pool shark Minnesota Fats, played by the great one himself, Jackie Gleason. In the end, Felson is the victor, but he's warned by the criminal element that his hustling days are over, or else. It's a down and dirty movie from 1961, with Newman not always sympathetic as the impulsive, often cruel Fast Eddie. It was based on a novel by Walter Tevis, who also wrote The Queen's Gambit, and over 2 decades later would revisit the character in his novel The Color of Money. The notion of revisiting his most famous character must have appealed to Paul Newman at the time, who was riding a renewed wave of popularity in the wake of delivering perhaps his finest performance ever in Sidney Lumet's The Verdict. It was the first time Newman seemed to really embrace middle age, and indeed, he looked a whole lot different in the mid-80s than he did in the early 60s. The notion of revisiting Fast Eddie in his middle age led to Newman pursuing Martin Scorsese as a director, with the star having been very impressed by Raging Bull. To note, Scorsese's career was at a low ebb in 1986. While Raging Bull won some Oscars, it hadn't made any money, and the me decade in Hollywood was all about generating cash and being commercially viable. Suffice to say, Scorsese just didn't really fit in. He wasn't Steven Spielberg or George Lucas. He wasn't making those kinds of movies. The King of Comedy was another critical hit that didn't make a dime, and his follow-up After Hours was also a huge flop. Scorsese had ambitions to make large-scale movies like The Last Temptation of Christ, but they were not commercial. To do so, he had to prove to the studios that not only could he stay on schedule and on budget, but he could also deliver a solid hit film as a hired gun. However, even if The Color of Money wouldn't necessarily be a passion project for Scorsese, the director was bent on making it as good as he possibly could, which led to him ditching the Walter Tevis novel in favor of an original screenplay by the great Richard Price. In this new film, we'd meet Fast Eddie deep into middle age. He hasn't touched a pool cue in years, with him instead peddling knockoff brands of whiskey to bars, which sounds like a big come down were it not for the fact that Fast Eddie's so charming, he's made an extremely comfortable living at his job. He seems to have a solid life worked out for himself, even romancing a pretty bartender played by Helen Shaver that's notably younger than he is. One day, he spies a young pool player with a shotgun break. That player is Tom Cruise's Vince, who's got the raw talent Fast Eddie used to have. In it, he spies the opportunity to make some serious cash, exploiting Vince the same way he was once exploited in The Hustler. To his surprise, though, their con games reawaken his love of the game, leading to Fast Eddie once again picking up the pool cue, only to realize he's no longer quite so fast and that Vince is a lot less naive than he seems. What makes The Color of Money especially interesting is the way filmmaking changed in the 25-year interval between The Hustler and The Color of Money. Recently, Tom Cruise had a huge hit with his legacy sequel, Top Gun Maverick, and it was made at an even longer interval, but Top Gun and Top Gun Maverick feel closer in age than The Hustler and The Color of Money. So much had changed with the form, and Newman, to his credit, gave Scorsese free rein to make it a true Martin Scorsese movie, which gives the film an honest contemporary vibe. The world of pool hustling has changed, with pool halls no longer controlled by the mob. They have bigger fish to fry in the 80s. Makes the world a lot less dangerous from a physical standpoint. Fast Eddie is annoyed by a lot of the new things in this world, particularly the way wannabes like John Turturro's character dabble with cocaine, with even Eddie at one point saying how different the vibe is from the 60s when the big vice was booze. Scorsese's choice of music is great in this, with him working with his usual music supervisor, Robbie Robertson of The Band, for a rock soundtrack that lends itself to some signature moments, including Vince demolishing competitors to Warren Zevon's Werewolf of London. This brings me to the Tom Cruise of it all. When Color of Money was cast, Tom Cruise hadn't come out, so people didn't really know how to peg him. Would Cruise be a flash-in-the-pan heartthrob like a Christopher Atkins from The Blue Lagoon, or was he as legit as someone like Sean Penn? Scorsese took a risk on him that paid off, with the movie becoming a pretty sizable hit thanks to Cruise's wave of megastardom following Top Gun. Cruise is great as Vince, with him evoking a great transition from being a smart-mouthed, sheltered kid to a protege that learns how to pull one over on his mentor. He's kind of the movie's villain rather than its hero, but it never judges him too harshly. For most of the movie, he's being used, not only by Eddie, but also by his trophy girlfriend, played by Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio, who reveals to Fast Eddie that she was once a thief who helped burgle Vince's upper-middle-class home before warming her way into his life. Vince starts off as a headstrong teen, but eventually becomes a slick player, very much in the Tom Cruise movie star mode. It would be really interesting to see a legacy sequel to the movie get made, with Scorsese of course directing, where Vince is now the older player mentoring someone younger. I wonder if Cruise can still play pool the way he used to in the 80s, with him having famously pulled off most of the trick shots featured in the film. In the end, The Color of Money wound up being a pretty major hit, grossing $52 million, a pretty decent number for 1986. That was only about a third of what Top Gun made, but all involved were likely very happy. It would help Scorsese get the funding he needed for Last Temptation of Christ, while it would also pave the way for Cruise to expand as a dramatic actor in Rain Man and Born on the 4th of July. Of everyone though, the one who got the most out of this movie was Paul Newman, and really it is his film. I mean, there are so many great sequences involving Paul Newman in this, particularly the one where he gets completely hustled by Forrest Whitaker, of all people, in a very early role, as this kind of shuffling pool player who everybody really underestimates but cleans Fast Eddie's clock, and man, the two of them together are electric. Forrest Whitaker walked out of this movie kind of a star, which is funny because nobody had really heard of him before this. It's one of those great one-scene roles, and he's terrific. Newman is just fantastic in this movie, and his shame at having been hustled is so palpable, but also you really root for him once he decides to stop screwing around and, become a legit pool player again. It was the movie that famously won Paul Newman the elusive Best Actor trophy at the Academy Awards, despite him infamously losing so many times in the past, with him losing for Cat in the Hot Tin Roof, The Hustler, HUD, Cool Hand Luke, Absence of Malice, and most inexplicably of all, The Verdict. Newman was so sure that he'd lose he didn't even attend the ceremony. He would always be grateful to Scorsese, mentioning that the best piece of acting advice he ever got came from him when Scorsese told him to stop trying to be funny. This admiration went two ways, with Scorsese producing and appearing in Ethan Hawke's recent The Last Movie Stars. Cruise wouldn't work with Scorsese again, given how different the genres they typically work in are, but never say never. Come on guys, give us a sequel. In 1988, Tom Cruise was arguably the biggest star in the world. Top Gun had come out in 1986 and wound up being the top-grossing movie of the year. It wasn't only a hit, it was a cultural phenomenon, and Cruise became a rare kind of movie star. He was a sex symbol for the ladies, but the guys liked him too. Speaking personally, having been born in 1981, I vividly remember owning the VHS tape of Top Gun and playing it on a loop. Cruise was my first concept of a movie star, and to kids like me, he was like a cool, big brother type figure. He was the guy we all wanted to be, with him riding motorcycles, rocking awesome hair, and an attitude which was never too threatening, while blasting awesome 80s rock music and having the girls fawn all over him. He was the man, and if any movie ever cemented his big screen stardom, it was 1988's Cocktail, which starred Cruise as the world's second coolest bartender. After Sam Malone on Cheers, of course. Cocktail is the very definition of a movie star vehicle. Thinly plotted, it only exists as a showcase of Cruise's charisma, and were anyone else playing the lead, it would only be a wisp of a movie. It's kind of trying to be the shampoo of the 1980s, but boy, it is nowhere near as layered as that movie. It came from Touchstone Pictures, which was a division of Walt Disney. Back in the 80s, they mastered the star-driven vehicle, producing a slew of comedies starring former B-listers they made into A-listers. Their hits included movies like Down and Out in Beverly Hills, Stakeout, Ruthless People, Outrageous Fortune, and, in 1987, their biggest hit ever, Three Men and a Baby. If any studio was primed to craft a music and sex-driven drama around Hollywood's newest heartthrob, it was them. However, Cocktail was originally supposed to be a bit weightier. It came from the pen of one Haywood Gould, who had done a page-one rewrite of one of the best movies of the 70s, Rolling Thunder, and specialized in darker fare like the Paul Newman action flick Fort Apache the Bronx and the They Cloned Hitler thriller The Boys from Brazil, amongst others. The film began life as a book written by Gould about a bartender in his 30s who struggled with the fact that his life simply couldn't live up to his ambitions. When Touchstone bought the material, Gould was tasked with turning his downbeat story into an upbeat one, starting by making his bartender character young and idealistic, with his whole life ahead of him. Cruise would play Brian Flanagan, but really, the character is essentially Maverick behind a bar. In fact, he's even playing a veteran, albeit of the Army rather than the Navy. Brian is just out of the service and has big dreams of making it in business. He heads to New York, but finds that his lack of a college degree means he can't get any entry-level job on Wall Street, so he takes some part-time work as a bartender, working under an older, aged bartender named Doug Coughlin, played by Brian Brown, who was just coming off the hit movie FX. Doug teaches Brian how to become a flair bartender, and soon the two are the hottest ticket in town, with them bartending at all the sexiest clubs. The two dream of opening their own place, but Ryan falls for a woman played by Gina Gershon, who Doug sleeps with in order to teach his protege not to fall in love. Brian hightails it to Jamaica in order to lick his wounds and tend bar on the beach, only for his mentor to track him down. Now Doug is married to an heiress, played by Kelly Lynch, and he encourages Brian to sink his claws into a rich woman in order to get his dreams financed. However, Brian has just fallen for an American girl, played by Elizabeth Shue, and he can't make up his mind between love and money. Being the 80s, money wins out, at first, only for Brian to eventually be taught a harsh lesson about how money can't buy happiness. While admittedly thin, co-star Kelly Lynch says the original cut of the film actually told a topical, layered story about love and money, but the studio opted to reshoot a big chunk of the movie. Indeed, the reshoots are painfully obvious, as Cruise's hair changes from scene to scene, as he'd grown his hair longer for his follow-up Rain Man and wasn't able to cut it. The film's continuity is a mess, and the ending is ridiculous in how it contrasts with the movie's message. We spend 90 minutes with Cruise's Brian Flanagan coming to terms with the fact that money can't buy happiness, but it turns out that his poor, pregnant lover is actually rich after all. What's worse is that Brian finds out way too early she's an heiress, making his pursuit of her in the last act feel more like a cold calculation, that he only loves her because she has money. They try to make us like Brian more by having Shue's father cut her off financially if she runs off with Brian, but given that the movie ends with him opening the sprawling bar of his dreams, did he really learn anything? Many criticize the film as emblematic of everything wrong morally with the me generation of the 80s. Here's the thing though, the movie still kicks a lot of ass. Why? 2 words: Tom Cruise. Any other actor would have made Brian repulsive, but Cruise is so damn likable that we always trust his intentions and root for him to get everything he wants. Cruise's megawatt charisma is turned up to 11 here, and the impression that this made on me as a 7-year-old watching it on VHS was profound. I would blast the cassette soundtrack while flair bartending juice boxes for my friends. The fact that Brian was a vacuous yuppie meant nothing to me. He was Tom Cruise. Looking at the film now, it's easy to point out its faults, but glaring continuity issues aside, it's a slick movie. Roger Donaldson directs this like a feature-length MTV video. Critics may not have liked it back then, but as a piece of nostalgia, it's top-notch. Brian Brown is cool in his own right as Cruise's older mentor, and even now, it's tough not to drool over Elizabeth Shue and Kelly Lynch, both of whom I should mention have aged as well as Cruise himself. Of course, the movie's second biggest star, after Tom Cruise, is the soundtrack, which was engineered to be as big of a hit as the film itself, after the Top Gun soundtrack sold 9 million copies. The soundtrack for Cocktail will go quadruple platinum, largely thanks to the biggest hit song off the soundtrack, the Beach Boys' Kokomo, a song which some people hate, I kinda love. Plus there was the Bobby McFerrin Don't Worry Be Happy song, the Georgia Satellites cover of the Hippie Hippie Shake, and a bunch of others. The movie ended up being a giant hit, grossing $78 million domestically, making it the 8th biggest hit of the year. But what was number one, you may ask? It just so happens the number one film also starred Tom Cruise and is the subject of our very next episode of Tom Cruise Revisited, Rain Man. In the end, Cocktail is silly, and compared to how amazing most of Tom Cruise's movies are, something of a footnote. He'd never act in a movie that is so thinly conceived or plotted again, but to those of us who grew up on Tom Cruise movies as kids, it cemented the concept of Cruise as the coolest guy of the 80s, and it's a flick I can't help but find to be an infectious blast. Tom Cruise is an iconic movie star, but all too often his acting talents are overlooked. Some of his dramatic performances, such as in Born on the 4th of July, Magnolia, The Last Samurai, and many others, put to shame a lot of the more acclaimed performances in their respective years. But his talent, too often, is taken for granted. Maybe it's that he makes it all look effortless. Back in the 80s, a lot of critics unfairly wrote him off as a pretty boy. His performance in The Color of Money had won over a few, but none super took him seriously until he paired up with Dustin Hoffman for Barry Levinson's Rain Man. In it, Cruise would play a selfish LA yuppie who discovers that he has a long-lost brother, Raymond, who's been left their late father's sizable estate. It turns out Raymond is autistic and has been confined to an institution for most of his life. Charlie takes custody of him as a way to get access to his father's money.
Raymond, am I using you? Am I using you, Raymond? Yeah. Shut up!
But it won't be easy to bring him home to LA, as Raymond refuses to fly. Well, except for Qantas, that is.
Qantas.
Qantas?
Qantas never crashed.
The two brothers embark on a classic road trip, and along the way, Charlie realizes that his brother is a mathematical savant, meaning a quick stopover in Vegas is in the cards so that his brother could win big at poker and cover all of Charlie's debts. Of course, Charlie starts to grow up as the film goes on, learning to value not only his brother, but also his relationship with his girlfriend Susanna, played by Valeria Golino. These days, when people discuss Rain Man, they tend to focus mostly on Dustin Hoffman's performance. Indeed, he has the showier role with him winning an Oscar for the part. Cruise wasn't even nominated. Revisiting the movie now, it's clear that Cruise grounds the film and is the protagonist, while Hoffman is actually supporting him and not the other way around. I think critics got lost in the flash of Cruise's performance, with him impeccably tailored throughout, sporting those classic Ray-Bans and a great 80s haircut. But Cruise brings a lot of vulnerability to the role, with him a charismatic hustler who's not quite the cold-blooded, calculating shark he needs to be. It's a terrific part, and indeed, the story of how Rain Man came to be is pretty interesting. Originally, Steven Spielberg was set to direct, but he needed to start work on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Sidney Pollack, who had made Tootsie with Dustin Hoffman, was also considered, but in the end, the job went to Barry Levinson. The Baltimore-born director was coming off of a massive hit, with him having directed Good Morning Vietnam the year before, which, of course, kinda made Robin Williams a massive star. The screenplay was written by Ron Bass and Barry Morrow, both of whom won an Oscar for it. Morrow was inspired by two real-life savants, Kim Peek and Bill Sachter. When the movie eventually got into trouble was with the idea that Raymond was not only a savant but also autistic. This harmed the public's perception of autism, with it really a totally separate condition from savant syndrome, and the odds of having both autism and being a savant are very, very tiny. The movie made it seem like it was commonplace. Nevertheless, Hoffman spent a year preparing for his role, and apparently was plagued with self-doubt throughout the filming, begging Barry Levinson to replace him with Bill Murray. Cruise and Hoffman apparently would rehearse and trade off roles in between filming, and indeed the two became close on set. One thing that's noteworthy is that Rain Man is one of the first American films to be scored by Hans Zimmer, whose unusual, partly electronic score earned him his first Oscar nomination. It was one of the first scores he composed without his regular collaborator Stanley Myers, and it really did kickstart his career, with him scoring Black Rain the next year, and quickly he became not only one of the hottest composers in town, but eventually a mogul. Rain Man was a smash hit at the box office, earning a massive $172 million domestically. This was good enough to make it the top-grossing movie of the year. Interestingly, it actually opened in second place at the box office behind a movie that it shared several similarities with, Twins. In the end, Rain Man would clean up at the Oscars, with Hoffman winning Best Actor, Levinson winning Best Director, and the film also taking home Best Picture and Best Screenplay. In the autism community, the movie has a mixed legacy. On the one hand, the film led to a common stereotype, being that people on the autism spectrum had savant-like abilities, but on the other hand, the movie also greatly increased awareness of the disorder. Notably, the movie also led to people believing that card counting is somehow illegal in Las Vegas. It's not, so if you're able to count cards, go ahead. While Cruise's performance would go to be somewhat unheralded, it did find one very prominent fan, with actor Michael Caine once citing it as his favorite screen performance of all time. It turns out the reason for this was intensely personal to Caine, with him discovering late in life that he too had a long-lost brother who had spent most of his life institutionalized. Indeed, Caine maintains that while Hoffman had the showy part, Cruise is the one that really required the most discipline, and indeed, it does remain one of the actor's best performances. But watching Dustin Hoffman win the Oscar might have stung a little for Tom Cruise, who in his next film would indeed get the showy part, and would prove once and for all that when he wants to, he can be as good of a dramatic actor as anyone.